guys, welcome to another episode of Payathon. This time we're jumping straight back into the code that we wrote in the previous lesson and expanding upon the classes and the class functionality. So if you guys haven't seen the last one, make sure you check it out because I kind of go through how to create classes and what classes are. And now we kind of want to give the class some actual functionality because the class is kind of useless, the one that we made. If I run this code again, you see we just get a cube in Maya. We can't really do anything to the cube. What I've done is I've stored the name of the cube in foo.cube so we can run that and you can see we get this string back. Not really that helpful. And I kind of went over like what dir does. It shows you all the methods associated with a cube. But now I want to create our own method. Much like how I showed you guys in the previous lesson, we can do something like bob.upper and run it and you can see we get capitalized Bob. So maybe if I rewrote this, you can see kind of what I'm trying to get at. So I'm going to name this bar. Okay, so we just store Bob, the string Bob, in a variable called bar, and we can do bar.upper. Okay, and we get that functionality. So it's renaming Bob so that it's capitalized. It's just performing some sort of function on top of the string object. Okay, so we can actually do our own custom methods associated with our objects so that we can do cool things like that as well. So what I want to do here is I want to give this particular object a way to rename itself. So we can rename, instead of pcube1, we can rename it to whatever we want. So to do that, we define our own little function within this class. And when you do something like this, it's known as a method. So it's what people refer to as a method of an object. So I'm going to create a new method. And in this method, I'm going to call this rename. Don't worry about the syntax highlighting. It's just Maya's script editor, kind of realizing that it's actually got a function named rename. So if I do cmds rename, you can see it highlights. And this is kind of why Maya tries to highlight these kinds of keywords, because it recognizes that it exists inside of cmds, but it doesn't actually affect our code or anything like that. This highlighting, just imagine it wasn't highlighted. Okay, or I can even change the name to something else, maybe rename an object or something, just so it doesn't highlight it. It doesn't really matter what you call this. I'm just going to call it rename because it's nice and easy. And the first thing we need to do is pass self so that this object has access to itself. This method, this particular method, is able to access its own internal data. Okay, and the last thing I need to do is actually give the object a name because we're renaming the object. So what kind of name do we want? So I'm going to actually add this parameter here, which we can specify later on and actually use that to rename our object. So I want to do cmds rename. And what do I want to rename? Well, I want to rename this cube here. So because we're using cmds, we need to look for the name of the cube and then rename it to something else. So what is the current name? Well, if you remember, we stored the current name in self.cube. Okay, so I can copy that and paste it down here. And what that means is we're going to access that current name, which we stored in self.cube, and we get that when we created the polycube. And then what I want to do is I want to name it to this new name, this parameter we're passing to it. So what's going to happen now when I run this rename function, it's going to look for self.cube name, and then it's going to use the cmds command and rename itself to the new name. So let's run this code, see how it looks. Delete this. I actually don't need this code here. So now when I run this code, you can see we get the cube. Nothing crazy like that, okay? Now I can do foo.rename and actually give it a new name. I'm going to call this Jack. Run, and you can see it's renamed it to Jack. But here's the problem. If I want to rename it to something else now, let's say Lucy, and I run this, we get an error because no object matches name. So what's happening there? Why am I getting an error when I try to use this again? Well, what happened is it renamed itself from pcube1 to Jack. And when we try to access this self.cube, it's just returning pcube1 again. So if I print this out, print self.cube, and let's run this code again. So let's delete this, and I'll just set this back to Jack, right? So let's run this, when I run foo.rename on its own, you can see it renamed, we renamed it to Jack, and it's showing us what the original name is. When I run this code again, if I change this to Lucy, if I run this code again, we get the error, but before we get the error, you can see it's printing out self.cube. And what self.cube is still pcube1. So that's the problem there. It's because Maya's trying to look for pcube1 again to rename it. And we've already changed the name from pcube1 to Jack. So there no longer exists an object called pcube1. So how do we solve this? Well, the easy way to solve this is once we rename the object, we can just set a new value for self.cube down here. We can say self.cube is equal to name. So what we're doing here is we're changing the internal attribute from pcube1 to whatever the new name is. So we're keeping track of that name as we keep renaming things. So this should work really well now. So when I run this code, we get our cube named pcube1, run this to rename it to be Lucy. Now we get Lucy there. Now I can rename this to Bob, for example. You can see it's worked, it's renamed it to Bob. Nothing crazy, right? So this is why classes can be really helpful, because we can keep track of all this data. You know, as we rename the object itself can keep track. This object here, this Python object, can keep track of the new name. So we don't have to store a variable outside of this object. You know, it kind of wraps all this functionality nicely. And then, you know, just on top of that, we can do a few other cool things, like we can delete this object, for example. So I can say delete self, and then I can do self.cube. And then what I want to do, I want to delete. So I want to delete this cube that we created there. So it's basically deleting itself. And then I'll delete this cube in the viewport so we can run this. We can run this code here. That works nice. We can rename this if we wanted. That works nice. And we have an additional method here where I can say delete, run that, and it deletes itself and it's gone. Okay, so that's the power of classes. You can have this kind of awesome functionality all wrapped up within this one particular object. So we can go a little bit further. When we create the object, we can actually pass additional parameters to this here, so that when we create it, we can actually use something like this parameter here, name, to set the name of the object itself. Okay, so here I can do something like Jack. So when I create the object, you can see it's already named Jack, and it stores that name in there. So we can still use foo.rename, and we can still rename it to whatever we want. Run that, you can see it works. So this is a cool way to add additional functionality to your Python objects, what we call methods. So you can create any number of methods you want that's tied to this particular Python object, and you can store your own attributes associated with that. So we can even go one step further than that and maybe specify things like the width or the height, you know, and we can pass those values here. So we can say something like width, and then we can come in here and add the width there. Although I'm not sure exactly what the width actually looks like, so we can do a quick search. I can do quick help, type pcube1, hit enter, and then we get a list of all the flags here that we can access. So it's if I wanted to change the width, it's just width like that, or we can use W. I'm going to type width just so it's a little bit clearer. We can turn off the quick help there, and I can say width is equal to width. So here I can say something like 10, delete this object, and delete that, and run this code, and now we get a cube named Jack, and it's also 10 in width. And just like any other regular functions, we can make these optional. So I can say optionally it's called cube, and the default width is maybe 5. So if we don't specify any of this and rerun this code, you can see it just uses these default values there. But if we wanted to change that, we can add something ourselves and that'll change that for us. Let's say something like name is equal to John and width is equal to 10. Run, and now we get John 10 length. So yeah, hopefully you understand a little bit more about classes now. In the next lesson, I'm going to go through some more interesting things related to classes, such as inheritance. And inheritance is one of the really big reasons why you want to use classes, because it allows you to reuse your code in a very efficient way. So yeah, make sure you guys stick around.